The mountain's mercy. They tied her to a chair in the town square on the coldest morning of the year. Eliza Moore's wrists burned beneath frozen rope, her breath clouding the air as 200 voices rose around her, not in her defense, but in mockery. The mayor stood on the platform above, holding a bag of rotting potatoes like evidence of murder. "Thief," he announced. "Glutton. Burden on decent folk." The crowd roared approval. Eliza closed her eyes, waiting for the first stone, the first blow, the inevitable end. Then boots crunched through snow behind the crowd, and a voice like winter thunder cut through the noise. "Show me proof or cut her loose." If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eliza's story travels. Hit that like button and stay with us until the end. This is a story about cruelty, courage, and the kind of love that doesn't ask permission. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. Eliza's eyes snapped open. Through the blur of cold tears and fear, she saw the crowd part. Not willingly, but like water forced aside by something too solid to resist. The man who walked through them stood a head taller than anyone in Iron Hollow, shoulders broad enough to block the morning sun. His coat was bearskin, worn and weathered, and his face was all hard angles beneath a dark beard shot through with gray. He didn't hurry. He didn't ask permission. He simply walked forward until he stood between Eliza and the platform where Mayor Hutchins held court. "Caleb Rourke." The mayor's voice had lost some of its theatrical power. "This doesn't concern you." "You're making a spectacle in my town," Caleb said. His voice was low, steady, and carried more weight than volume. "That concerns me. You say she's a thief. Show me what she stole." "Potatoes," Hutchins said, lifting the burlap sack higher. "Rotten or not, they belong to Garrett's store. She had no right." "Did Garrett press charges?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Hutchins' jaw tightened. "Garrett is sick. I'm acting on behalf of—" "So no." Caleb's gaze swept the crowd, cold and measuring. "Anyone here see her take anything?" Silence. Shuffling feet, averted eyes. "Anyone got proof beyond a bag of rotting food that was probably headed for the hogs anyway?" More silence. Eliza felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it. She'd lived in Iron Hollow for 2 years, ever since the wagon that carried her west had broken down and left her stranded with no money and no prospects. 2 years of scraps and charity that came with sermons. 2 years of sideways looks and whispered comments about her size, her appetite, her unwillingness to simply disappear. "She's been a burden since she arrived," a woman called from the crowd. Mrs. Halloway, whose charity had come with the most conditions. "Eating what honest folk earn, then honest folk should stop feeding her," Caleb said, still not raising his voice. "If you don't want to help, don't. But don't dress up your cruelty as justice." Hutchins' face flushed red. "You've been gone from this town for 3 years, Rourke. You don't get to—" "I get to stop a lynching." Caleb moved toward Eliza, each step deliberate. "That's what this is. You tied a woman to a chair in freezing weather without trial, without evidence, and invited the whole town to throw stones. You wanted entertainment, not justice." He reached Eliza, and she flinched despite herself. But his hands, when they touched the ropes, were careful. The knife he drew from his belt was sharp enough that the bindings fell away in 2 clean cuts. Eliza's arms dropped, nerveless and aching, and she would have fallen if Caleb hadn't caught her elbow. "Can you stand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Her legs shook, but they held. "Then walk with me." He shrugged out of his bearskin coat and draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it, the warmth, the sheer unexpected kindness of the gesture. It broke something in Eliza that 2 years of cruelty hadn't managed to touch. Tears spilled hot down her frozen cheeks. "This isn't over," Hutchins said, his voice tight with rage. "She can't just—" "She can." Caleb turned, keeping himself between Eliza and the crowd. "And she will. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." No one moved. Caleb's reputation, it seemed, still carried weight in Iron Hollow, even after 3 years in the mountains. He was known. Eliza had heard the stories, though she'd never seen the man himself. The trapper who'd lost his mind to grief. The hermit who only came to town twice a year for supplies and spoke to no one. The legend who'd once killed a grizzly with nothing but a knife and refused to tell the story. "Let's go," Caleb said quietly, and Eliza walked. The crowd parted again. She kept her eyes down, focused on the snow beneath her feet, on the too large coat that smelled of pine smoke and leather, and safety. She didn't look at Mrs. Halloway or the baker who'd given her yesterday's bread for a month before deciding she wasn't grateful enough. She didn't look at the children who'd thrown snow and insults in equal measure, or the men who'd watched her tie to that chair without a single word of protest. She just walked, one foot in front of the other, until the voices faded and the buildings gave way to open snow and the forest beyond. "Keep going," Caleb said when she hesitated at the tree line. "Don't stop until we're out of sight." So she didn't. She walked until her legs burned and her lungs ached, and the town was nothing but a smudge of smoke against white sky. She walked until Caleb finally stopped beside a frozen creek, where the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. "Sit," he said, nodding toward a fallen log. Eliza sat. Her whole body shook now. Cold, shock, delayed terror. She couldn't tell which. Caleb crouched in front of her, studying her face with an intensity that should have been frightening, but somehow wasn't. "You hurt?" She shook her head. "Don't lie. I saw how you favored your left side." "Bruised," she admitted. Her voice came out rough, barely used. "From when they grabbed me. Not broken." He nodded, accepting this. From a pack she hadn't noticed he carried, he produced a canteen and a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Drink, then eat." "I'm not—" She stopped. She'd been about to say she wasn't hungry, the automatic lie she'd learned to tell, but the bread in the cloth was fresh and her stomach betrayed her with a low, desperate growl. "Eat," Caleb repeated, no judgment in his voice. "You'll need your strength." "For what?" "For deciding." Eliza took the bread with trembling hands, tore off a piece, chewed slowly. It was good. Better than good. Real bread. Not the stale charity kind. She ate 3 bites before she could make herself speak again. Deciding what? What happens next? Caleb stood, scanning the tree line with the automatic wariness of a man used to threats. "You can't go back to Iron Hollow. Not after that. Hutchins won't let it go, and next time I might not be there. I have nowhere else." "You have choices." He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I can take you to the trading post at Bent Creek. 3 days' walk if the weather holds. They'll have wagons heading east, south, wherever you want to go. Or I can take you to the Sisters of Mercy in Helena. They take in women with nowhere else, no questions asked." "Or?" Eliza heard the word in his pause. "Or you come with me. To my cabin. It's another 2 days past Bent Creek, up in the high country. You'd be safe there until spring, at least, until you figure out what you want." "Why would you do that?" The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice was rougher. "Because I've seen what happens when no one does anything, and I'm tired of it." It wasn't a romantic answer. It wasn't even a particularly comforting one, but it was honest, and Eliza had learned to value honesty more than comfort. "I'd be a burden," she said. "Everyone says, everyone in Iron Hollow is a coward and a fool." The words were matter of fact, not angry. "You want to know what I see? I see someone who survived 2 years in a town that wanted her gone. That takes strength, the kind I can use." "Use for what?" "Winter." He offered her a hand up. "It's hard in the mountains, lonely. Having someone else there, someone to talk to share the work, that's worth more than gold. You'd earn your keep just by being human company." Eliza stared at his outstretched hand, calloused, scarred, steady. She thought about the Sisters of Mercy, the weight of charity and prayer. She thought about a wagon east, back to nothing and no one. She thought about the cabin in the mountains, the strange, quiet man offering her choices instead of commands. She took his hand. "The cabin," she said, "until spring." His grip was firm, respectful. He pulled her to her feet without effort, then released her immediately. "We'll need to move. Storm's coming, and we want to be past the first ridge before it hits." They walked. Caleb set a pace that was brisk but not cruel, and when Eliza struggled with the deeper snow, he simply adjusted without comment. He didn't push her beyond her limits. He didn't criticize. He just walked, and she followed, and slowly the panic in her chest began to ease. The storm caught them as dusk fell, snow coming down in thick, heavy curtains that turned the world into shades of white and gray. Caleb led them to a rock overhang he seemed to know by instinct, and within minutes had a fire burning in a ring of stones that looked well used. "We'll stay here tonight," he said, unpacking his bedroll and a second blanket that he handed to Eliza. "Be warmer than trying to push through in the dark." She watched him work, efficient and economical, every movement purposeful. He set up a small lean-to with pine branches, banking the fire so the smoke drew away from their shelter. He heated water in a battered tin pot, added something that smelled of herbs and salt, and handed her a cup. "Broth," he said. "Drink it slow." She did, feeling warmth spread through her chest and belly. Across the fire, Caleb ate jerky and hardtack, his gaze on the storm beyond their shelter. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said after a while. "Go ahead." "Why did you come to town today? You said you only go twice a year." "Needed salt. Some other things." He paused. "And I was curious." "About what?" "Whether Iron Hollow had gotten any better since I left." His expression was grim. "Guess I have my answer." "You lived there once?" "For a while." He fed another branch to the fire. 3-4 years back, before I went to the mountains. "What drove you away?" The question was too personal, too soon, and Eliza knew it the moment the words left her mouth. But Caleb didn't seem angry. He just looked at her, considering, and then looked back at the fire. "Grief," he said simply, "and the kind of regret that doesn't ease, even in solitude." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It's old history." He shifted, pulling his coat tighter. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a longer walk." Eliza lay down, wrapping herself in the blanket and the remains of the bearskin coat Caleb had given her. The ground was hard and cold. The wind howled beyond their shelter, and she was sleeping in a forest with a stranger who'd saved her from a mob for reasons she didn't fully understand. But for the first time in 2 years, she felt safe. She woke once in the night to find Caleb still awake, feeding the fire, his eyes on the darkness beyond. Standing watch, she realized, keeping her safe even while she slept. She closed her eyes again, and this time she dreamed of mountains. The next 2 days were a blur of snow and stone and silent walking. Caleb led them higher into the mountains, following paths only he could see, and Eliza followed with grim determination. Her body ached, her feet blistered inside her worn boots, but she didn't complain, and Caleb didn't coddle her. He simply adjusted the pace when she flagged, offered water when she needed it, and kept them moving toward whatever destination he had in mind. They passed through forests so thick the snow barely reached the ground, across frozen streams where the ice sang under their weight, up slopes so steep Eliza had to use her hands as much as her feet. And through it all, Caleb was patient. Not kind, exactly. Kindness implied softness, and there was nothing soft about the man. But patient, present, watchful. On the second evening, they crested a ridge, and Eliza saw the cabin for the first time. It sat in a small valley, backed against a cliff face, surrounded by pine and aspen. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, which meant Caleb had banked a fire before he'd left. The structure was solid, logs chinked with clay and moss, a roof weighted with stones, shutters that looked like they could withstand a siege. Not large, but well made, defensible. "Home," Caleb said, and there was something in his voice that made the words sound like both a promise and a confession. They descended into the valley as the last light faded. Caleb unlocked the heavy door, and warmth spilled out to meet them. The lingering heat of coals that had smoldered for days, waiting for his return. He coaxed the fire back to life while Eliza stood just inside the threshold, taking in the space. One room, but larger than she'd expected. A bed in one corner, neatly made. A table and 2 chairs. Shelves lined with books, tools, supplies organized with military precision, furs on the floor. A pot hanging over the hearth. Everything clean, everything purposeful, everything speaking of a man who'd built himself a life in solitude and meant to keep it that way. "You'll take the bed," Caleb said, not looking at her. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't." "You can." His tone allowed no argument. You're still recovering, and it's warmer there. I'm used to the floor. He meant it, she realized. This wasn't chivalry for show. It was practical care, offered without expectation of gratitude or reciprocation. Thank you, she said quietly. He nodded, already moving to unpack his supplies. There's a water barrel outside, fed by snowmelt from the cliff. You'll need to break the ice each morning. There's an outhouse 20 paces north. I keep the path clear. Food's in the cellar, access through the trap door there. You're welcome to whatever you need, whenever you need it. I don't keep accounts or rations here. The casual generosity of it made Eliza's throat tight. What do you want me to do? Do? To earn my keep. You said I would. Caleb paused, considering. Can you cook? Some. Can you sew? Better. Good. I've got clothes that need mending, and I'm tired of eating my own cooking. He met her eyes. Beyond that, do what feels right. If you see something that needs doing, do it. If you need rest, rest. I'm not your employer, and you're not my servant. We're just two people sharing a winter. That's simple? That's simple. It wasn't, of course. Nothing was ever that simple. But Eliza wanted to believe it might be, so she nodded and let Caleb show her where things were kept, how the cabin worked, what routines kept them alive in the high country. That night she lay in Caleb's bed, clean sheets, a mattress stuffed with pine needles and dried grass, blankets that smelled of wool and smoke, and listened to him breathe across the room. Steady, even. The sound of someone at peace, or at least at home. Outside, the wind howled. Snow piled against the shutters. Winter settled over the valley like a fist. And inside, in the warmth and quiet, Eliza Moore began to heal. The days took on a rhythm. Caleb rose before dawn, tended the fire, checked his trap lines in the hours after first light. Eliza woke to find coffee already made, bread sometimes warming by the hearth, the cabin chores he'd finished before she'd even opened her eyes. She took over the cooking, made good on her promise to mend his clothes, organized the supplies in ways that made sense to her. They worked in companionable silence most days, spoke in short exchanges when words were needed, and slowly learned the shape of each other's presence. Caleb was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, he meant what he said. He taught Eliza how to read the weather, how to preserve meat, how to move quietly through snow. He answered her questions with patience and never made her feel foolish for not knowing. And he never, not once, mentioned her size or her appetite or the things Iron Hollow had found so worthy of mockery. He just treated her like a person, like someone whose presence mattered. It was the strangest, most unexpected gift Eliza had ever received. 2 weeks into her stay, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of Caleb's voice, low, rough, caught in the grip of some dream. She rose from the bed, moving quietly toward the fire where he slept. He thrashed beneath his blanket, one hand reaching for something that wasn't there, and the sound he made was pure anguish. "Caleb," she said softly, not touching him, "you're dreaming." His eyes opened, unfocused and wild, and for a moment she thought he didn't recognize her. Then awareness returned and he sat up slowly, his breathing harsh. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't? I was already awake." A lie, but a kind one. "Are you all right?" He scrubbed a hand over his face, and in the firelight, he looked older, worn. "Fine, just ghosts." Eliza sat down on the floor beside him, leaving space between them. "You want to talk about it?" "No." She accepted this. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn low, until Caleb spoke again. "Her name was Sarah," he said quietly. "We were married for 2 years. She died the 3rd winter we were together. Fever. I couldn't get her to a doctor in time. Too much snow, too far to go. She died here, in this cabin, and I couldn't do anything but watch." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Eliza didn't try to fill the quiet with platitudes or comfort. She just listened. "I left after that," Caleb continued. "Couldn't stand to be here with her gone. Went to Iron Hollow, tried to live among people again. But it didn't take. Everything felt hollow. So I came back, and I've been here ever since." "Do you regret it?" Coming back? No. He looked at her then, his expression unguarded. This is where she lived, where we were happy. Leaving felt like abandoning her, but living here alone, that's not abandonment. That's remembrance. She must have been extraordinary, Eliza said softly. She was, but so is anyone who chooses to see the good in people instead of the worst. He paused. Like you did today, not judging me for old grief. Everyone carries something, Eliza said. It's not my place to judge. They sat together until the fire was embers, and then Caleb rose and added another log, bringing the warmth back to life. Get some sleep, he said. Morning comes early. Eliza returned to the bed, but she didn't sleep right away. She thought about Sarah, about grief that didn't ease, about a man who'd built a sanctuary in the mountains and now shared it with a stranger because he'd seen cruelty and refused to let it stand. Outside, the wind gentled. The snow fell soft and steady. And in the cabin, two people who'd been broken by the world found, however briefly, a measure of peace. The weeks blurred together in a pattern of survival and unexpected companionship. Eliza discovered she had a talent for reading the mountain's moods, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the quality of silence that meant snow was coming, the particular cold that settled in the valley when the temperature would drop dangerously low. Caleb noticed, though he said nothing at first. He simply began asking her opinion before checking his trap lines, adjusting his routes based on her observations, trusting her instincts the way he trusted his own. It was a small thing, that trust, but it mattered more than Eliza knew how to express. She learned other things too. How to tan a hide properly, scraping the flesh away with patient, repetitive motions until the leather was soft and supple. How to render fat into tallow for candles and soap. How to identify animal tracks in snow, the delicate prints of rabbit, the heavier tread of deer, the distinctive pattern of wolf that made Caleb's jaw tighten whenever they appeared too close to the cabin. They won't bother us unless we give them reason, he said one morning, crouched beside a set of tracks that circled their water barrel. But they're curious. Watching. Does that worry you? Everything worries me. He stood, scanning the tree line with that perpetual vigilance she'd come to recognize. That's what keeps us alive. They work together more often now. Caleb showed her how to check the snares he'd set for small game, how to reset them without leaving human scent that would spook the animals. Eliza proved surprisingly adept at it, her hands steady and sure despite the cold. The first time she brought back 2 rabbits she'd harvested herself, Caleb looked at her with something that might have been approval. Good, he said simply. That's good work. She felt the praise warm her more than the fire ever could. But there were harder days, too. Days when the cold was so brutal that even moving from bed to hearth felt like a journey through ice. Days when the wind screamed against the shutters, and Eliza wondered if the cabin would hold, though Caleb's calm presence always steadied her fear. Days when she caught him staring at Sarah's things, a shawl hanging on a peg, a cup on the shelf, small remnants of a life that had ended too soon, and the grief in his eyes was so raw she had to look away. On those days she gave him space, made herself useful in quiet ways, prepared meals he barely touched, mended clothes that didn't need mending, let the silence be what it needed to be. And slowly, incrementally, something shifted between them. It started with small conversations, Caleb asking about her life before Iron Hollow, and Eliza surprising herself by answering honestly. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, the youngest of 6 children in a family that never had quite enough of anything. About her father's death when she was 12, the slow dissolution of her family as siblings scattered to find work. About the promise of the West, the wagon train that was supposed to carry her to a new life in California, the broken axle, and the wagon master who'd left her behind with barely a backward glance. Said I'd slow them down, she said, staring into her coffee. Said they couldn't afford to wait while I found another way forward. They gave me $5 and wished me luck. Bastards, Caleb said quietly. I thought I'd find work in Iron Hollow. Thought someone would need a seamstress or a cook or just an extra pair of hands, but all anyone saw was... She gestured at herself, the words catching in her throat. What they wanted to see, Caleb finished. What made them feel superior? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup between his hands. I grew up in Missouri. Family farm, 5 generations of Rourkes working the same land. I was supposed to stay, take it over when my father got too old. But I couldn't stomach it. The sameness, the certainty that every day would be exactly like the one before. So I left, headed west like half the young fools in America, looking for something I couldn't even name. Did you find it? I found Sarah. His voice softened. Met her at a trading post in Wyoming Territory. She was traveling with a missionary group, heading to Montana to start a school for frontier children. We talked for 3 hours straight, and by the end of it, I knew I'd follow her anywhere. He paused. So I did. Helped her build the school, married her 6 months later, and when she decided she wanted to live out here, away from towns and their politics, I built this cabin with my own hands. She sounds remarkable. She was fierce, Caleb said, and there was something like pride in his voice beneath the grief. Wouldn't tolerate injustice, wouldn't back down from a fight she believed in. She'd have liked you, I think. You've got that same steel underneath. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But the words settled into her chest like a seed, something that might grow given time and light. The next morning, she woke to find Caleb already gone, a note left on the table in his careful handwriting. Checking the eastern line, back by midday. Coffee's hot. She poured herself a cup and sat by the fire, watching snow fall past the window. The cabin felt different without Caleb's presence. Not empty, exactly, but waiting. She found herself listening for his footsteps, the sound of his voice, the particular way he moved through space. It unsettled her, that awareness. She'd been alone for so long, had learned to need no one, expect nothing. But here in this cabin, with this quiet, damaged man who treated her like she mattered, she felt the old walls beginning to crack. Midday came and went. No Caleb. By early afternoon, Eliza's unease had sharpened into worry. She stood by the window, scanning the tree line, seeing nothing but snow and shadow. The wind had picked up, blowing the fresh powder into drifts that erased tracks almost as quickly as they were made. When the door finally opened 2 hours past, when he'd promised, Eliza spun around, relief flooding through her, only to freeze at the sight of Caleb in the doorway. Blood stained his left sleeve, dark and spreading. His face was pale beneath the beard, jaw set against pain. He carried something over his shoulder, a wolf, she realized, massive and gray and very dead. It's not as bad as it looks, he said, which meant it was exactly as bad as it looked. Eliza moved without thinking, crossing to him and taking his arm. Sit. Now. The wolf can wait. Sit. He obeyed, lowering himself into a chair with a grimace that told her everything about how much pain he was in. Eliza grabbed her sewing kit and the bottle of whiskey Caleb kept for emergencies, then carefully peeled back his coat and shirt. The wound was a savage tear along his forearm, deep enough to need stitching but not deep enough to have hit anything vital. Claw marks, she thought. The wolf had gotten closer than Caleb had wanted. What happened? It was in one of the snares, Caleb said, his voice tight. Caught by the leg, half mad with pain and fear. I tried to put it down quick, but it got loose and came at me. Had to kill it close. Eliza poured whiskey over the wound, and Caleb hissed through his teeth but didn't pull away. She worked efficiently, threading a needle, closing the torn flesh with small, careful stitches. Her hands were steady. She'd done this before. Mended her brother's after farm accidents, stitched her own cuts when there was no one else to help. The skill came back easily, muscle memory taking over. You're good at this, Caleb said, watching her work. Had practice. She tied off the last stitch, bandaged the wound with clean cloth. It'll scar, but it should heal clean if you keep it dry and don't do anything stupid. Define stupid. Anything that involves fighting wolves. She met his eyes, saw the ghost of a smile there despite the pain. I'm serious, Caleb. You could have died out there. But I didn't. Only because you're lucky and stubborn. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, fear transmuting into anger. What if you'd bled out before you made it back? What if the wound had been worse? What if... Hey, his good hand caught hers, gentle but firm. I'm here. I'm fine. You fixed me up, and I'll be more careful next time. There shouldn't be a next time. Eliza. He waited until she looked at him. This is the life. Animals get desperate in winter, same as people. Sometimes they fight back. Sometimes we get hurt. But we heal, and we keep going, because that's what survival is. She knew he was right, knew it in her bones. But the sight of him standing in the doorway, bleeding and pale, had terrified her in a way she hadn't expected. Because somewhere in the last few weeks, Caleb had become more than just the man who'd saved her. He'd become the person she talked to in the evenings, the presence that made the cabin feel like home, the one solid thing in a world that had proven itself unreliable. The thought of losing that, losing him, was unbearable. "I know," she said finally, pulling her hand back. I worried. I noticed. Something shifted in his expression, something warm and complicated. "Thank you for that." They skinned the wolf together that evening, Caleb working one-handed while Eliza followed his instructions. The pelt was beautiful despite the violence of its acquisition, thick and silver gray, the fur still winter plush. Caleb said they'd cure it properly, use it for a blanket or trade it come spring. But first they needed to render what they could, waste nothing, honor the animal that had died. It was a philosophy Eliza had learned governed everything Caleb did. He took only what he needed, used everything he took, and approached the mountain with respect rather than conquest. It was a different way of living than anything she'd known in Philadelphia or Iron Hollow, where consumption was status and waste was expected. Out here, there was only survival, only the honest exchange between need and resource, life and death, respect and thanksgiving. That night, Caleb's fever spiked. Eliza woke to the sound of his breathing. Too fast, too shallow, the rasp of someone fighting infection. She lit a candle and crossed to where he lay by the fire, pressed her hand to his forehead, and felt the heat radiating from his skin. "Caleb," she shook his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened, glassy and unfocused. "Sarah?" The name hit Eliza like a fist. "No, it's Eliza. You're fevered." "Cold," he muttered. "So cold." She piled more blankets over him, built up the fire until the cabin was sweltering, and forced him to drink water mixed with willow bark she found in his medicine supplies. All night she stayed beside him, changing the bandage when blood seeped through, cooling his face with damp cloth when the fever raged highest, talking to him in a low, steady voice, even when she wasn't sure he could hear. She told him about Philadelphia, about the row house where she'd grown up, and the market where her mother had sold vegetables every Saturday. She told him about her brothers, loud, brash, protective in their careless way, and her sisters who'd married young to escape poverty and chaos. She told him about the first dress she'd ever sewn, how proud she'd been of the crooked seams and uneven hem, how her mother had worn it anyway and called her talented. She told him things she'd never told anyone, because the darkness and the fever made confession feel safe, necessary, like the last honest thing she might have a chance to say. "You can't die," she whispered as dawn began to gray the windows. "I won't let you. Do you hear me, Caleb Rourke? You saved my life and I'm saving yours. And then we're even and you don't get to leave me alone in this godforsaken mountain." His hand found hers, grip weak but deliberate. "Not leaving," he rasped. "Promise." The fever broke an hour after sunrise. Caleb woke clear-headed and exhausted, his fever-bright eyes replaced with his usual sharp awareness. He looked at Eliza, still sitting beside him, her face drawn with sleeplessness and worry. "How long?" "All night." "You should have slept." "Couldn't." She helped him sit up, held water to his lips. "How do you feel?" "Like I fought a wolf and lost." He managed a weak smile. "But alive. Thanks to you." "We're even now," Eliza said, trying to match his lightness and failing. "You saved me from Iron Hollow. I saved you from infection. We can call it square." "Not even close." Caleb's expression turned serious. "What you did last night, staying with me, tending the wound, keeping the fever from taking hold, that's not just returning a favor. That's choosing to care when you didn't have to." "Of course I had to. You're—" She stopped, not sure how to finish that sentence. "I'm what?" "You're important," she said finally. "To me. This place, this life. It's the first time I've felt like I belonged somewhere in years. And you're the reason for that. So yes, I had to. Because losing you would mean losing all of this, and I'm not ready for that." The silence that followed was different than the comfortable quiet they'd grown used to. This was charged, weighted with things neither of them knew how to name. Caleb looked at her like he was seeing something new, something that surprised him. "Eliza." A sound outside cut him off. Voices. Multiple voices, carrying through the morning air. And then a shout. "Rourke, we know you're in there!" Caleb's expression went hard. He pushed himself to his feet despite Eliza's protest, crossed to the window and looked out. What he saw made his jaw clench. "How many?" Eliza whispered. 5. Maybe 6. He turned to her and his eyes were cold with a fury she'd never seen before. "It's Hutchins. He brought men from Iron Hollow." Eliza felt ice slide down her spine. "What do they want?" "Me to hand you over, most likely." Caleb moved to where his rifle leaned against the wall, checked it with practiced efficiency despite his injured arm. "Or to make an example. Hutchins doesn't like being challenged, especially not publicly." "Caleb, you're hurt. You can't—" "I can." He looked at her and his expression gentled slightly. "Trust me?" She nodded, because there was no other answer. "Good. Stay inside, no matter what you hear. Keep away from the windows. If shooting starts, get into the cellar and don't come out until I tell you it's safe. And if you don't, I will." He touched her face briefly, his hand rough but careful. "I didn't survive 3 years alone on this mountain, just to lose now. But if something goes wrong, there's a map in the bottom drawer of the table. It'll get you to Bent Creek. Tell them what happened. They'll help you." Before Eliza could respond, Caleb opened the door and stepped out into the snow. She watched through the gap in the shutters, her heart hammering against her ribs. Caleb stood on the small porch, rifle held loosely but ready, facing 6 men on horseback. Mayor Hutchins sat his horse front and center, flanked by men Eliza recognized from Iron Hollow, the blacksmith, 2 ranch hands, men who'd stood silent while she was tied to a chair and mocked. "Hutchins," Caleb said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, "you're on my land." "Your land?" Hutchins' laugh was ugly. "This is open territory, Rourke. You don't own the mountain. I own this valley and everything in it, which means you're trespassing." Caleb's stance shifted slightly, weight settling into something that looked relaxed, but wasn't. "State your business and leave." "Business is simple. You took something that doesn't belong to you." "I took a woman you were about to lynch without trial. That doesn't make her property. She's a thief and a burden, and the town decided—" "The town decided nothing," Caleb interrupted, his voice flat and cold. "You decided. You wanted a show, wanted to feel powerful, so you tied up someone who couldn't fight back and invited people to throw stones. That's not justice. That's cowardice." Hutchins' face flushed red. "You've got no right to judge us. You ran away to these mountains because you couldn't handle civilized life. I came to these mountains because I was tired of watching weak men pretend to be strong by hurting people weaker than them." Caleb raised the rifle slightly, a subtle but unmistakable threat. "Now leave. This is your only warning." "We're not leaving without the girl." "Yes, you are." Caleb's voice dropped lower, colder. "One way or another." One of the ranch hands shifted nervously. "Mayor, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Davis." Hutchins kept his eyes on Caleb. "You think you can stand against 6 armed men, Rourke? You think—" The rifle shot cracked through the clearing, sharp and final. The bullet struck the snow 3 feet in front of Hutchins' horse, which reared and nearly threw him. The other horses spooked, and it took the men several seconds to regain control. When they did, Caleb had already rechambered another round. "Next one won't be a warning," he said quietly. "It'll be the last mistake you ever make." Inside the cabin, Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She'd never seen violence like this, controlled, purposeful, deadly in its precision. Caleb stood utterly still, utterly calm, and she understood with sudden clarity that he was entirely capable of killing every man in that clearing if they pushed him to it. Hutchins seemed to understand too, but pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "The town has rights," he said, his voice shaking slightly. That woman has a name," Caleb said, "Eliza Moore. And she's under my protection now, which means she's under the mountain's protection. You want her? You go through me. You want to try that? Go ahead. Draw your weapon. Let's see how it ends." The silence stretched. None of the men moved. Even Hutchins, for all his bluster, couldn't seem to force himself to reach for the pistol at his hip. "Didn't think so," Caleb said after a long moment. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn those horses around and ride back to Iron Hollow. You're going to tell everyone there that Eliza Moore is gone, that she's not coming back, and that anyone who comes looking for her up here is going to find more trouble than they can handle. You're going to leave her alone. Forever. And if we don't? Then I come to Iron Hollow." Caleb's smile was not kind. "And I remind everyone there what happens when weak men push too far. I don't think you want that, Hutchins. I don't think the town wants that. So take the easy way. Turn around. Leave." For a moment, Eliza thought Hutchins might do something stupid. His hand twitched toward his gun, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. But then Davis, the ranch hand, spoke up again. "He's right, Mayor. This ain't worth dying over." The other men murmured agreement. Hutchins looked around, saw no support, and finally nodded stiffly. "This isn't over, Rourke." "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." Hutchins turned his horse with a vicious jerk of the reins and rode back toward the tree line. The other men followed, some with backward glances, all with visible relief. Within minutes, they disappeared into the forest, and the clearing was silent again except for the wind in the pines. Caleb stood there for a long moment, rifle still ready, making sure they were truly gone. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he turned back toward the cabin. Eliza met him at the door. Without thinking, she wrapped her arms around him, pressed her face against his chest, and felt him stiffen in surprise before his good arm came up to hold her. "It's all right," he said into her hair. "They're gone. You could have been killed." "But I wasn't." He pulled back enough to look at her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "And neither were you. That's what matters." "Is it really over?" Caleb's expression was grim. "For now. Hutchins won't risk coming back here. He'd lose too many men, and he knows it. But he'll nurse that grudge. If you ever go back to Iron Hollow—" "I won't," Eliza said firmly. "There's nothing there for me anymore." "Then it's over," Caleb agreed. "You're safe here. I promise you that." She believed him. Against all reason, against all her experience with promises broken and safety stolen, she believed him. They spent the rest of the day in quiet recovery. Caleb's fever was gone, but the confrontation had cost him strength he didn't have to spare. Eliza made him rest, changed his bandage again, and prepared a rich stew from the wolf meat they'd preserved. They ate in silence, the weight of what had almost happened settling between them. That night, as Eliza lay in bed and listened to Caleb's breathing from across the room, she realized something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't temporary anymore. This wasn't just waiting out the winter until spring offered other options. This was choosing to stay, choosing to build something here, choosing Caleb and the mountain and the life they were creating together. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. 3 days passed before Caleb felt strong enough to check the trap lines again. Eliza watched him test his injured arm each morning, flexing the fingers, rotating the wrist, checking for stiffness or weakness. The wound was healing clean, her stitches had held and no infection had set in, but the muscle beneath was still tender, still rebuilding. "I'm coming with you," she said on the 4th morning, before he could protest. Caleb looked up from the coffee she'd poured him, surprise flickering across his features. "It's a long walk. Rough terrain." "I know. I've gotten stronger." She met his eyes steadily. "And you shouldn't be out there alone. Not yet." He studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't quite read. Then he nodded. "All right, but we take it slow, and if I say we turn back, we turn back." "Agreed." They left at dawn, moving through snow that had crusted overnight into a surface that crunched beneath their boots. Caleb led them northeast, following a route he knew by heart, even though no visible path existed. Eliza stayed close, matching his pace, watching how he read the landscape, a broken branch here, a scuff in the bark there, small signs that told him where animals had passed and where his snares might yield results. The first 3 traps were empty. The 4th held a rabbit, frozen stiff in the night cold. Caleb reset the snare with practiced efficiency while Eliza held the catch, and they moved on. It was at the 6th trap that everything changed. They heard the voices before they saw the men, rough, urgent, punctuated by a woman's scream. Caleb's hand shot out, stopping Eliza mid-stride. He tilted his head, listening, then pointed toward a stand of aspens 50 yards ahead. They moved in silence, using the trees for cover, until they could see the clearing beyond. 3 men surrounded a woman and a boy. The woman clutched the child against her side, her free hand raised in a futile gesture of protection. One of the men held a pistol loosely, not quite aimed but ready. The others flanked her, cutting off any escape. "Just give us the horse," the man with the gun said, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. "You can keep the wagon, keep your supplies. We just want the horse." "Please," the woman said, her voice breaking. "It's all we have. We'll die out here without—" "Not our problem, lady." The gunman stepped closer. "Hand over the reins, or we take them and anything else we want." Eliza felt Caleb go rigid beside her. His hand moved to the rifle slung across his back, drawing it forward with careful silence. She grabbed his wrist, shaking her head frantically. 3 against 1, and him still injured. The math didn't work. But Caleb pulled free gently, his expression set in that cold, determined way she'd seen when Hutchins had come. He leaned close, his breath warm against her ear. "Stay here. If shooting starts, run back to the cabin." "Caleb, stay here," he repeated, then moved forward before she could argue further. He walked out of the trees like he'd materialized from the mountain itself, rifle held ready, but not yet raised. The 3 men spun toward him, hands flying to their weapons. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice calm and even. "No one needs to die today." The gunman recovered first, swinging his pistol toward Caleb. "This doesn't concern you, friend. Move along." "Can't do that." Caleb kept walking, slow and steady, until he stood between the men and the woman. "Lady and her boy need that horse. You're going to leave them be." "Or what?" The second man drew his own pistol, emboldened by numbers. "You're outnumbered, old man. You really want to make this a problem?" "I'm making it a solution." Caleb's rifle came up in one smooth motion, aimed squarely at the gunman's chest. "You 3 are going to put your weapons down, apologize to the lady, and walk away, right now." From her hiding place, Eliza watched the scene unfold with her heart in her throat. She could see the calculation in the men's eyes, the weighing of odds and pride. 3 armed men against 1. But that one stood absolutely still, absolutely certain, and his rifle never wavered. "You won't shoot," the gunman said, but his voice held less conviction now. "Not over a horse and some stranger." "Try me," Caleb said quietly. "See what happens." The silence stretched. The woman clutched her son tighter, the boy's face buried against her coat. Wind stirred the aspens, their bare branches clicking together like bones. Then the third man, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. "Ain't worth it, Cole. Look at him. That's a man who's killed before and won't lose sleep over doing it again." The gunman, Cole, stared at Caleb, trying to read weakness that wasn't there. Finally, slowly, he lowered his pistol. "Fine. Keep the damn horse. There's easier pickings elsewhere." "Smart choice," Caleb said. "Now, apologize." "What?" "You heard me. You terrorized this woman and her child. Apologize before you leave." Cole's jaw worked, pride warring with self-preservation. Self-preservation won. "Sorry, ma'am," he muttered. "Now go." The 3 men backed away, weapons holstered but hands still hovering near them, eyes never leaving Caleb. They reached their own horses tethered at the clearing's edge, mounted up, and rode off without another word. Caleb kept his rifle raised until they disappeared completely into the trees. Only then did he lower it and turn to the woman. "You all right, ma'am?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you. I thought they were going to—" Her voice broke. "You're safe now." Caleb's voice gentled. "Where are you headed?" "Helena. My husband went ahead 3 weeks ago to find work, sent word for us to follow, but the guide we hired took our money and disappeared 2 days back, and we've been lost ever since." Caleb looked at the wagon, taking in its poor condition and sparse supplies. The horse was old, half-starved, barely fit for the journey ahead. The woman herself looked exhausted, her son hollow-eyed with hunger and cold. "Helena's 40 miles northeast," Caleb said. "You won't make it in that wagon with that horse." We have to try, the woman said desperately. We have nowhere else to go. Eliza emerged from the trees then, unable to stay hidden any longer. The woman startled, but Caleb just glanced at her and nodded, as if he'd known exactly where she was the whole time. This is Eliza, he said. We live about 3 miles south of here. You and the boy can come with us, rest up for a few days, and I'll guide you to Helena when you're stronger. I couldn't impose it. It's not an imposition. Caleb was already moving toward the wagon, examining the axle and wheels with a critical eye. It's survival. You won't last another night out here alone, and that boy needs hot food and warm shelter. We have both. The woman looked between Caleb and Eliza, searching for the trap, the hidden cost. Eliza understood that wariness. She'd worn it herself not so long ago. He means it, she said softly. There's no trick. Just help when it's needed. The woman's resistance crumbled. She sagged against the wagon, relief and exhaustion overtaking pride. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Her name was Margaret Fletcher, and her son was called Thomas. He was 7 years old, silent and watchful, clinging to his mother's skirt as they made their way back to the cabin. Margaret talked in nervous bursts as they walked, filling the silence with details about her husband James, a carpenter who'd found work rebuilding after a fire in Helena, about their farm in Illinois that had failed after 2 bad harvests, about the desperate hope that had driven them west in search of something better. Eliza listened, remembering her own desperate journey, her own failed hopes. She caught Caleb's eye once and saw the same recognition there. This was how it happened, how people ended up broken and stranded on the frontier. One bad choice, one piece of bad luck, one guide who disappeared with all their money. The cabin felt smaller with 4 people in it, but warmer too. Margaret wept when she saw the fire, the food Eliza set out, the simple comfort of walls and shelter. Thomas ate 3 bowls of stew without speaking, his eyes huge and grateful. Caleb gave them the bed without discussion, settling himself by the fire as always. Eliza made a pallet near him, close enough to share warmth, but respectful of space. That night, after Margaret and Thomas had fallen into exhausted sleep, Caleb and Eliza sat together in the firelight, speaking in whispers. We can't keep them here long, Caleb said. Supplies won't stretch that far, and winter's only getting harder. I know. Eliza pulled her blanket tighter. How long until you can take them to Helena? A week, maybe. Need to make sure the boy's strong enough for the journey, and I need my arm fully healed. Can't risk getting caught in a fight I can't finish. Those men today, they might come back. They won't. Caleb's voice held certainty. They're cowards. They prey on the weak because it's easy, but they won't risk facing someone who'll shoot back. Eliza was quiet for a moment, watching the fire cast shadows across his face. You would have killed them if they'd drawn on you. Yes. No hesitation, no apology, just truth. Does it bother you? She asked, knowing you could do that? Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. It bothers me that I have to, but out here, mercy and weakness get confused. Sometimes the only way to protect the people who can't protect themselves is to be harder than the people who'd hurt them. That's a lonely way to live. It was. Something shifted in his eyes. It's less lonely now. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. We should sleep, she said, looking away. Morning comes early. It does, Caleb agreed, but he didn't move. Neither did she. The week that followed was strange and domestic, in ways that surprised them both. Margaret proved skilled with a needle, and she and Eliza spent hours mending and altering clothes while Thomas played quiet games by the hearth. The boy was shy at first, traumatized by too much hardship too young, but Caleb's steady, patient presence gradually drew him out. He showed Thomas how to whittle, how to identify different types of wood, how to read animal tracks in the snow near the cabin. Watching them together did something to Eliza's heart she didn't quite understand. Caleb was gentle with the boy in a way that spoke of practice, of some old instinct he'd buried after Sarah's death. And Thomas bloomed under that attention, smiling more each day, asking questions in a voice that grew stronger and more confident. He's good with children, Margaret said one afternoon, watching through the window as Caleb helped Thomas build a small sled from pine branches. "Does he have any of his own?" "No," Eliza said. "He was married once, but she died before they could start a family." "That's a terrible sadness." Margaret's voice was soft. "But he seems less broken than you'd expect. Like he's found something worth living for again." Eliza didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on her stitching and said nothing. But that night, alone in the darkness while the others slept, she admitted to herself what she'd been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Caleb Rourke, with his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, his absolute refusal to let cruelty go unchallenged, with the way he looked at her like she mattered, like she was strong rather than weak, capable rather than burdensome, with the life they were building together in this cabin on the mountain. The realization terrified her. Love meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. She'd lost so much already: family, home, dignity, hope. The thought of opening herself to that kind of pain again made her want to retreat, to protect herself behind the walls she'd built in Iron Hollow. But Caleb made those walls feel unnecessary, made her feel safe enough to be soft, strong enough to be honest. She didn't know what to do with that. On the 8th day, Caleb declared everyone ready for the journey to Helena. His arm had healed enough for him to trust it, Thomas had regained color and energy, and Margaret had recovered the determination that hardship had temporarily stolen. They would leave at dawn, travel hard for 2 days, and reach Helena before the next storm hit. "I'm coming with you," Eliza said that evening. Caleb looked up from checking his pack, surprise clear on his face. "It's a hard journey. Unnecessary for you to—" "I'm coming," she repeated firmly. "You'll need help with Thomas if the travel gets rough, and Margaret will feel safer with another woman along. Besides," she hesitated, then pushed forward, "I don't want to be here alone." The last part came out more vulnerable than she'd intended. Caleb's expression softened. "All right," he said quietly. "We leave at first light." They set out in pre-dawn darkness, the 4 of them moving in single file through snow that had frozen hard overnight. Caleb led, breaking trail, with Thomas behind him, mimicking his steps exactly as he'd been taught. Margaret followed, and Eliza brought up the rear, watchful for any sign of trouble. The first day passed without incident. They covered good ground, stopping only for brief rests and quick meals of jerky and dried fruit. Thomas tired toward evening, and Caleb carried him the last 2 miles on his shoulders without complaint. They camped in a natural shelter formed by fallen boulders, built a small fire, and slept in shifts with Caleb taking the longest watch. The second day was harder. Wind picked up, bringing stinging snow that cut visibility to mere yards. The temperature dropped until even moving felt like fighting through ice. Thomas struggled, his small legs unable to keep pace, and Margaret's cough, which had seemed minor in the cabin, worsened with exertion and cold. By midday, they were only halfway to Helena, and Caleb made the decision to find shelter and wait out the weather. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile east," he said, studying the sky with a grim expression. "Might be occupied, might not, but it's closer than Helena, and we need to get out of this wind." They found the cabin just as the storm intensified. It was smaller than Caleb's, rougher, clearly abandoned for at least a season, but it had a roof and walls and a hearth that still drew properly. Caleb got a fire going while Eliza tended to Margaret, whose cough had turned wet and concerning. "Just a cold," Margaret insisted, but her fever told a different story. "Rest," Eliza said firmly. "We're not going anywhere until you're better." Thomas curled against his mother, his face tight with worry. Caleb caught Eliza's eye across the fire, and she saw her own concern reflected there. They were stuck here now, at least until the storm passed and Margaret recovered. And if Margaret got worse... She pushed the thought away. One crisis at a time. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days trapped in a cabin barely large enough for 4 people, with supplies running low and Margaret's condition deteriorating despite Eliza's best efforts. The fever spiked and fell unpredictably. The cough rattled deep in her chest, and she spent hours in fitful sleep punctuated by moments of delirious clarity. Caleb went out twice to hunt, returning with rabbit both times and wet to the bone from snow that fell in relentless curtains. Eliza made thin stews that stretched their supplies, kept the fire burning, and sat up through the night sponging Margaret's face with cool water. Thomas watched everything with silent, terrified eyes. On the third night, when his mother's breathing grew especially labored, he finally broke. "Is Mama going to die?" he whispered to Eliza. She wanted to lie, to offer false comfort, but the boy deserved truth. "I don't know," she said gently. "She's very sick, but she's also very strong, and we're doing everything we can to help her." "Papa needs her," Thomas said, tears spilling down his cheeks. "He needs both of us. We can't die before we find him." Eliza pulled the boy close, let him cry against her shoulder, and made promises she had no power to keep, that they'd find his father, that his mother would recover, that everything would be all right. Across the fire, Caleb watched with an expression of such profound sadness that Eliza's heart broke for him. She knew he was remembering Sarah, remembering helplessness in the face of fever and death, remembering loss that no amount of strength or skill could prevent. On the fourth morning, Margaret's fever finally broke. She woke clear-headed and weak, her cough still present but gentler. Eliza nearly wept with relief. "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse. 3 days, Eliza said. "The storm's passed. We can move on as soon as you're strong enough." "Today," Margaret said. "We go today. I won't risk—" She looked at Thomas, and her eyes filled. "I won't risk him getting sick too. We need to reach Helena." Caleb assessed her with a critical eye, then nodded. "We go slow, but we go." They reached Helena at dusk, half frozen and exhausted. Caleb led them straight to the church, knowing the minister would help find Margaret's husband and arrange shelter. Within an hour, James Fletcher had been located, working late at a carpentry site, and the reunion between husband, wife, and son was something beautiful to witness. James wept, Margaret wept. Thomas clung to his father like a lifeline, and Caleb and Eliza stood back, witnesses to joy they'd helped make possible. "I can't thank you enough," James said when he could speak again, gripping Caleb's hand. "You saved their lives. If there's anything at all I can do, just take care of them," Caleb said. "That's all the thanks I need." They stayed in Helena that night, accepting the minister's offer of a room in the church's boarding house. It was the first time Eliza had slept in a real bed in a real town since Iron Hollow, and it felt strange, alien, too soft, too warm, too separated from the mountain and the life she'd grown to value. She rose in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, and found Caleb standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered streets. "Can't sleep either?" she asked softly. "Too quiet," he said. "Too many walls between me and everything else." "I know what you mean." She moved to stand beside him. "It feels wrong, doesn't it, being here?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "We should head back tomorrow, before the next storm." "Agreed." They stood together in comfortable silence, and Eliza felt the truth settle in her bones. The mountain was home now. The cabin was home. And Caleb was home too. They left Helena at dawn, retracing their steps through snow that had already begun to fill in their old trail. The journey back was faster, just the two of them with no one to slow their pace. They moved with the easy synchronization of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who trusted each other's instincts. But something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed during those days in the trapper's cabin, watching Margaret fight for her life while Thomas fought his fear. Or maybe it had happened before that. In 100 small moments, neither of them had noticed individually. The accumulated weight of shared survival, shared purpose, shared everything. They reached the cabin at dusk on the second day. Caleb unlocked the door, and they stepped into warmth that welcomed them back. Home. Truly home. Truly. Eliza moved to start the fire while Caleb unpacked their gear. Normal tasks, normal routine, but the air felt charged, expectant, like something waiting to be acknowledged. "Eliza," Caleb's voice stopped her mid-motion. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Open. Vulnerable. Uncertain in a way that the mountain man who'd faced down armed thugs had never been. "I need to tell you something," he said. Her heart hammered. "All right. These past months with you here, they've been the best I've had since Sarah died. Maybe before that. You make this place feel like more than just a shelter. You make it feel like a life worth living." He took a breath. "And I know it's too soon, I know you've got your own healing to do, but I need you to know. I want you to stay. Not just until spring, not just until you figure out what's next. I want you to stay because this is where you belong. Here. With me. Eliza's breath caught. Every fear she'd been nursing, every wall she'd been maintaining, crumbled in the face of that raw honesty. Caleb, you don't have to answer now, he said quickly. I just needed you to know, needed to be honest about I'm pregnant, Eliza blurted out. Silence crashed between them like an avalanche. Caleb stared at her, and Eliza watched every emotion cross his face in quick succession. Shock. Confusion. Understanding. And then something that looked like careful, cautious hope. How long have you known? His voice was steady, but she could hear the strain beneath it. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. She wrapped her arms around herself. I wasn't sure at first, but then the signs are all there. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how, and I was afraid Afraid I'd what? Send me away, she whispered. Think I was trying to trap you or use you or… Eliza, look at me. She did, terrified of what she'd see. But Caleb's expression was gentle, fierce, determined. Who's the father? The question surprised her. I don't know his name. One of the ranch hands in Iron Hollow. It wasn't… The words stuck in her throat, shame and old fear choking her. It wasn't my choice. Understanding flooded Caleb's eyes, followed by cold fury. Did he hurt you? Yes. The admission came out small, broken. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a gentleness that made tears spill hot down her cheeks. I'm sorry, he said into her hair. I'm so damn sorry that happened to you. I thought you'd be angry, Eliza sobbed against his chest. Thought you'd see me as ruined or… You're not ruined. He pulled back enough to look at her, framing her face with careful hands. You're not anything but a woman who survived something terrible and came out the other side. The child changes nothing about what I said. If anything, it makes it more important. His voice roughened. Stay, Eliza. Stay and let me protect you both. Let me be a father to this child, if you'll have me. Let me prove that not all men are… She kissed him before he could finish. It was clumsy and desperate and tasted of tears, but it was real. And when Caleb kissed her back, careful and reverent, Eliza felt something in her chest crack open and spill light. Yes, she whispered against his mouth. Yes, I'll stay. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the fire crackled and the mountain wind sang against the shutters. When they finally pulled apart, Caleb kept his hands on Eliza's shoulders, grounding her, anchoring her to this moment and this choice. We'll need to prepare, he said quietly. A baby changes everything. We'll need more supplies, warmer blankets, proper medicine in case something goes wrong. I know. Eliza wiped her eyes, steadying herself. But spring is still months away and I won't be able to travel once the snow gets worse. We're stuck here until the thaw. Then we make do with what we have and plan for what we need. Caleb's expression was thoughtful, already working through logistics. I can trade some pelts in Bent Creek next month, get what we can't make ourselves. And there's a midwife there, a Shoshone woman who knows more about birthing than any doctor. I'll ask her to come when the time gets close. The casual certainty with which he spoke about the future, their future, the baby's future, made Eliza's throat tight again. He wasn't running, wasn't making excuses or looking for ways to extract himself from responsibility that wasn't biologically his. He was simply accepting this new reality and adapting to it the way he adapted to everything else on the mountain, with purpose, with competence, with care. Why are you doing this? She asked, needing to understand. You don't owe me anything, Caleb. You saved my life, gave me shelter, and that's more than anyone else would have done. But this, raising another man's child, binding yourself to someone you barely know, why would you choose that? Caleb was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned truth. After Sarah died, I thought I was done. Done with people. Done with caring. Done with anything that could hurt that much when it was taken away. I came back to this mountain to hide, really. To exist without living. He looked at her then, his eyes clear and honest. But you changed that. Watching you survive what Iron Hollow did to you. Watching you get stronger every day. Watching you choose to stay when you could have left. It reminded me that hiding isn't the same as healing. And this child... He paused, searching for words. This child deserves a father who chooses them, who wants them. The circumstances of their beginning don't define their worth. You'll really do this? Eliza's voice was barely a whisper. Be a father to a child who isn't yours? The child will be mine, Caleb said firmly. In every way that matters, if you'll let me. She kissed him again, softer this time, trying to pour everything she couldn't say into the gesture. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm terrified. I'm hopeful. I think I love you. He seemed to understand. His arms tightened around her, careful of her body in a new way now, protective of the life growing within her that was invisible but already precious. That night, Eliza slept in Caleb's arms for the first time, both of them on the furs by the fire. It wasn't passionate or even particularly romantic. They were too exhausted, too raw from confession and commitment. But it was intimate in a way that mattered more. The simple trust of shared warmth, shared breath, shared dreams. She woke once in the darkness to find Caleb's hand resting gently on her still flat stomach, and something in her heart settled into certainty. This was right. This was home. The weeks that followed fell into new rhythms shaped by preparation and planning. Caleb spent hours carving a cradle from pine, his hands patient and skilled as he shaped the wood into something beautiful and functional. Eliza sewed tiny clothes from fabric she'd found in the cabin's storage chest, her stitches small and careful, imagining the child who would wear them. They talked about names sometimes, late at night when the fire burned low, discussed how they'd teach the child to read, to hunt, to understand the mountain and respect its power. But beneath the domesticity and hope ran a current of worry that neither of them spoke aloud. Childbirth on the frontier was dangerous even with a doctor nearby. Out here, isolated by snow and distance, with only Caleb's limited knowledge and whatever help the midwife could provide if she arrived in time. The risks were real and significant. Eliza felt them in her bones every time she woke with morning sickness, every time she noticed her body changing in small but undeniable ways. And she saw them in Caleb's eyes whenever he thought she wasn't looking, the shadow of old grief mixing with new fear. But they didn't speak of it. Speaking would make it real in a way neither could afford. Instead, they focused on what they could control, building up their stores of food and fuel, reinforcing the cabin against the deep cold that was still to come, creating a space that could support 3 lives instead of 2. It was during one of these preparations, a month after Eliza's confession, that the riders came. Caleb saw them first. He'd been outside splitting wood when he straightened suddenly, his eyes fixed on the tree line to the south. Eliza, working near the window, saw his posture change, saw him reach for the rifle that was never far from his side, and her stomach dropped. "Caleb?" she called through the door. "Get inside, bar the door." The calm command in his voice made her obey without question. She slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the bar into place, then moved to the window where she could see without being easily seen. 4 riders emerged from the trees. Not the men from Iron Hollow, these were different, harder. Their clothes were worn and stained, their horses thin and travel-weary. One of them had a military coat that had seen better days. Another wore a hat with a bullet hole through the crown. Drifters, Eliza thought. Maybe deserters, the kind of men who survived by taking what they needed from people weaker than themselves. Caleb stood in the center of the clearing, rifle held loosely but ready. He didn't speak, didn't call out. Just waited with that supernatural stillness that made him seem more like a feature of the mountain than a man. The riders stopped 20 feet away. The one in front, tall, scarred, with eyes that cataloged everything, smiled, though the expression held no warmth. "Afternoon," he said pleasantly. "Name's Garrett. These are my associates. We're traveling through, looking for a place to wait out the next storm. Saw your smoke and thought maybe you'd be willing to share your fire." "No," Caleb said flatly. Garrett's smile widened. "Now that's not very neighborly. We're not asking for much, just a warm place to sleep for a night or 2. And I'm not offering. There's a trapper's cabin 2 miles east. It's empty. Use that." "We found that cabin. Roof's got holes, chimney doesn't draw right. This one looks much better. Garrett's gaze moved past Caleb to the cabin itself, calculating. Besides, we could use a hot meal, and maybe some company. Gets lonely on the trail. Inside, Eliza felt ice slide down her spine. She knew what men like this wanted, what they'd take if given the chance. Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened fractionally. You've got 3 seconds to turn those horses around and ride out. After that, I start shooting. 4 against 1, one of the other riders said, his hand dropping to his pistol. You really think you can? The rifle shot cracked through the clearing, impossibly loud. The hat with the bullet hole flew off the man's head. A new hole punched clean through the crown. The horses spooked, dancing sideways, and the riders fought for control. When they'd settled, Caleb had already rechambered another round. That was a warning, he said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. The next one won't be. Now get the hell off my land before I decide you're not worth the mercy. Garrett's pleasant mask had slipped, revealing something vicious underneath. You just made a mistake, friend. We'll leave now, but we'll remember this. And one day, when you're not expecting it, we'll come back and settle accounts. I'll be ready, Caleb said. I'm always ready. The riders left, but Eliza could see it in their eyes as they turned away. This wasn't over. They'd remember the cabin, the location, the insult of being turned away at gunpoint, and they'd come back just like Garrett promised. When they disappeared into the trees, Caleb stood there for another 5 minutes, watching, making sure they were truly gone. Only then did he return to the cabin, and Eliza opened the door to let him in. We need to leave, he said without preamble. Tonight. What? Why? Because those men are going to circle back as soon as the storm hits. They'll wait until visibility is low, until I can't see them coming, and then they'll take what they want. The cabin, the supplies, you... His voice roughened. I can't defend this place against 4 armed men and protect you at the same time. Not with certainty, not with your life, and the baby's on the line. Eliza felt panic rise in her throat. Where would we go? It's the middle of winter, I'm pregnant, we can't just... Bent Creek, Caleb said, already moving to gather supplies. It's 5 days hard travel, but there's a settlement there. Real buildings, real protection. We can stay until spring, until after the baby comes. Then we'll decide what's next. But this is your home. Sarah's home. You can't just abandon it because of some drifters. I can if it means keeping you safe. He stopped, turning to face her fully. This cabin is wood and stone. It can be rebuilt. But you... He touched her face gently. You can't. And I won't risk losing you to make a stand over a building. The certainty in his voice, the absolute prioritization of her life over everything else, made Eliza's resistance crumble. He was right. The cabin was just a place. Safety mattered more. All right, she said quietly. We go to Bent Creek. They packed through the afternoon and into the evening, taking only what they could carry and what they'd need for survival. Food, blankets, weapons, the few precious items that couldn't be replaced. Caleb moved with grim efficiency, his jaw set against leaving but his resolve unshaken. This was survival, this was protection, and he'd learned long ago that attachment to places could kill you as surely as a bullet. They left at dawn, moving fast through snow that had started falling again during the night. Caleb set a pace that was brutal but necessary, and Eliza pushed herself to match it despite the exhaustion that pregnancy had brought. They couldn't afford to be slow. Couldn't afford to be caught in the open if Garrett and his men doubled back. The first day was hardest. Eliza's body protested the exertion, and she had to stop twice to be sick in the snow. Caleb didn't comment, just waited patiently and helped her clean up before they continued. By evening, they'd covered only half the distance he'd hoped, and his expression was tight with worry. We'll camp here, he said, finding another rock overhang that offered some shelter. But we keep the fire small and the watch constant. Eliza collapsed onto the furs he spread, too tired to even eat the jerky he offered. Her whole body ached and fear gnawed at her gut. What if the travel was too much? What if she lost the baby because they'd had to run? What if Garrett found them anyway? Caleb must have read her thoughts because he settled beside her, one hand moving to her stomach in that protective gesture that was becoming habit. We're going to be all right, he said quietly. I promise you that. You can't promise that. You can't control everything. No, but I can control whether we keep moving or give up. And I choose moving. His hand pressed gently. This child deserves to be born safe. You deserve to be safe. That's worth any discomfort, any distance, any sacrifice. She wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, so she nodded and closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. She dreamed of fire and screaming, of hands grabbing her in the darkness, of Caleb's voice calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. She woke gasping, disoriented, to find Caleb holding her with one arm while the other held his rifle trained on the darkness beyond their small fire. What? Shh, he breathed. Listen. She did, straining her ears against the wind, and then she heard it, voices in the distance, muffled by snow, but unmistakably human. Multiple voices. Searching. They'd been followed. Caleb's expression was grim. He doused the fire with snow, plunging them into darkness, broken only by moonlight filtering through clouds. Then he pulled Eliza to her feet, gathered their packs with swift efficiency, and led her deeper into the rocks. They moved in absolute silence, Caleb guiding her with touches rather than words, his hand warm and sure on her back. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Garrett and his men, combing the area, looking for the smoke that had given away their position. Caleb found a crevice between two massive boulders, a gap barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. He pushed Eliza in first, followed her into the tight space, and they huddled there in the dark while footsteps crunched through snow less than 30 feet away. "They were here," someone said, one of the riders from the cabin. "Fire's still warm." "Spread out," Garrett's voice commanded. "They can't have gone far. The woman's pregnant. She'll slow them down." Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing. Beside her, Caleb was utterly still, the rifle across his lap, ready to shoot the moment he had no other choice. The footsteps came closer. Closer. A shadow passed across the gap where they hid, so near that Eliza could have reached out and touched the man's coat. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure it would give them away. Then a voice called from farther away. "Found tracks heading north." The shadow moved away. The footsteps receded. Garrett shouted orders, and the men regrouped and headed in the wrong direction, following tracks that some animal had left hours earlier. Caleb and Eliza stayed frozen in their hiding place until the voices faded completely into the distance. Only then did Caleb let out a slow, careful breath. "We need to move," he whispered. "Now, while they're chasing ghosts. We go east, fast as we can, and we don't stop until we're far enough ahead that they can't pick up our trail again." They emerged from the crevice and ran. Not the measured pace of earlier, but a desperate sprint through snow and darkness, trusting Caleb's instincts to guide them. Eliza's lungs burned, her legs screamed protest, but she didn't slow. Couldn't slow. Behind them was capture, violation, death. Ahead was only the slim hope of escape. They ran until Eliza couldn't take another step, until she collapsed in the snow, gasping and retching. Caleb caught her before she fell completely, held her while she emptied her stomach of the little food she'd eaten, then lifted her bodily and kept moving. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Save your strength." His voice was strained but steady. "We're almost to the river. Once we cross, we'll be harder to track." The river was frozen solid, the ice thick enough to support their weight, but treacherous with hidden weak spots. Caleb tested each step before committing, moving with agonizing slowness across the 40-foot span. Eliza clung to him, too exhausted and frightened to do anything but trust. They made it across just as the ice behind them groaned ominously. Caleb pulled Eliza up the far bank and into the trees, where the evergreen canopy blocked some of the falling snow and made their tracks less obvious. Only then, finally, did he let them stop. "Are we safe?" Eliza asked, her voice barely audible. "For now." Caleb scanned the darkness behind them, eyes sharp despite exhaustion. "They'll lose our trail at the river. By the time they figure out we crossed, we'll be hours ahead. But we can't rest long. Dawn's coming, and we need to be farther away before they can see our tracks clearly." They allowed themselves an hour. Caleb built no fire, offered no comfort beyond his presence, and the shared warmth of their bodies huddled together under the firs. Eliza dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, her nerves too raw for real sleep. When gray light began to seep through the trees, they moved again. The next 3 days blurred into an endless nightmare of cold, exhaustion, and constant vigilance. They traveled during daylight hours when they could see threats coming, hid during darkness when any fire would give away their position. Caleb hunted when opportunity allowed, bringing down a deer on the second day that gave them much-needed protein. Eliza rationed their water, melting snow in her mouth to stay hydrated when they couldn't risk stopping to make fire. Her body was failing. She could feel it in the cramping that had started in her abdomen, in the spotting that terrified her each time she saw it. The baby was at risk. She was at risk. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until they reached safety. On the fourth day, Caleb's injury from the wolf fight reopened. Eliza saw blood seeping through his coat and demanded to see the wound. The stitches had torn, the flesh beneath angry and inflamed from overuse. She had nothing to treat it with. No clean bandages, no antiseptic. All she could do was pack it with clean snow and hope infection didn't set in. "We're not going to make it," she said that night, the words torn from her by despair and exhaustion. "Yes, we are." Caleb's voice was hoarse but certain. "Bent Creek is one more day. One more day, Eliza, and we're there. You can do this. The baby is strong, like you." He pulled her close, and she felt him shaking, from cold or pain or fear, she couldn't tell. Maybe all three. "We've come this far. We don't give up now." She didn't have the strength to argue, didn't have the strength for anything but holding on and hoping he was right. The fifth day dawned clear and brutally cold. They moved like ghosts through a landscape of white and silence, their breath freezing in the air, their feet numb despite the extra socks Caleb had insisted they wear. Eliza counted steps to keep herself moving. 100, 200, 500, 1,000. At step 4,312, she saw smoke. "Caleb," she croaked, pointing. He looked and relief flooded his face. "Bent Creek. We made it." The settlement was small, maybe 20 buildings clustered around a trading post, but it looked like paradise to Eliza's exhausted eyes. Caleb half carried her the last quarter mile, and they stumbled into the trading post just as her legs finally gave out completely. A woman's voice called out in alarm. Hands caught Eliza as she fell. Someone was shouting for the midwife, for blankets, for hot water. Caleb's voice cut through the chaos, explaining in short, clipped sentences about the riders, the chase, the need for immediate help. Then everything went dark. Eliza woke to warmth and softness, and the smell of herbs she didn't recognize. She was in a real bed, in a real room, with actual walls and a ceiling that didn't leak. Her hand went immediately to her stomach, panic flooding through her. "Easy," a woman's voice said. An older woman with long gray braids and kind eyes leaned into view. "The baby's fine." "You're fine. You just exhausted yourself near to death getting here." "Caleb?" Eliza tried to sit up and was gently but firmly pushed back down. "Sleeping in the next room. He wouldn't rest until I convinced him you were stable." The woman, the midwife, Eliza realized, smiled slightly. "That man of yours is stubborn as a mule and twice as protective. Fought me for 2 hours before he'd let me examine you without him present." We're not." Eliza stopped, not sure how to explain their relationship. "Whatever you are, he loves you." The midwife's expression was knowing. "And that baby you're carrying has a father who chose it, which is more than many children get." Tears pricked Eliza's eyes. "How long have I been asleep?" 2 days. You needed it. Now you need food and rest and to stop trying to kill yourself running through mountains in winter." The midwife stood, moving toward the door. "I'll get you some broth. You stay put." She left, and Eliza lay there feeling like she'd been broken apart and reassembled wrong. Every muscle ached. Her head throbbed. But the baby was alive. They'd made it. The door opened again, and Caleb appeared. His arm was freshly bandaged, his face drawn with exhaustion and lingering worry. But when he saw her awake, his expression transformed into something that made her heart clench. "You're awake," he said unnecessarily. "So are you." She held out her hand, and he crossed the room in 3 strides to take it. "The midwife said you wouldn't sleep." "Couldn't, not until I knew." His voice roughened. "I thought I'd lost you. When you collapsed, when you wouldn't wake up, I thought, I'm here." She squeezed his hand. We both are. We made it. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle her, and pressed his forehead against her joined hands. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying. Silent, restrained, but crying nonetheless. I'm sorry, he said. I'm so damn sorry. I should have gotten you out sooner. Should have anticipated Garrett would follow. Should have... You saved us, Eliza interrupted. You got us here alive when anyone else would have failed. There's nothing to apologize for. You almost lost the baby. But I didn't. We didn't. She touched his face with her free hand, making him look at her. We survived because you knew what to do and refused to give up. That's all that matters. He kissed her palm, his beard rough against her skin. I love you, he said quietly. I should have said it before. Should have told you weeks ago. But I love you, Eliza. More than I thought I could love anyone after Sarah. Different, but just as real. The words settled into her chest like light, warming places that had been cold for so long. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while. They stayed like that, holding each other, while outside the wind howled and snow fell, and somewhere behind them 4 dangerous men hunted for prey that had slipped through their fingers. But here, in this room in Bent Creek, Eliza and Caleb were safe. We're together. We're building something that violence and cruelty couldn't destroy. And that, Eliza thought, as exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep, was worth every hardship they'd endured. Recovery came slowly, measured in days that blurred into weeks as winter tightened its grip on Bent Creek. The midwife, whose name was Mourning Dove, a Shoshone woman who'd married a French trapper and outlived him by 20 years, kept Eliza confined to bed for the first week, ignoring her protests with the calm authority of someone who'd delivered more babies than she could count and knew exactly how close Eliza had come to losing hers. You rest, or you lose that child, Mourning Dove said bluntly on the 3rd day, when Eliza tried to get up and help with chores. Your body needs to heal. The baby needs you still. So you stay in that bed until I say otherwise. Caleb enforced the order with gentle but unyielding persistence, bringing her meals, reading to her from the books he'd borrowed from the trading post, sitting beside her in the evenings and talking about nothing and everything. He told her about the settlement, about the families who'd helped them without question or judgment, about the work he'd found at the lumber mill to pay for their room and board. The owner's name is Henrik Johansson, Caleb said one evening, his hand resting on her stomach in that way that had become natural between them. Norwegian. Lost his wife and son to scarlet fever 2 years back. When I told him our situation, he didn't ask questions, just offered me work and said we could stay as long as we needed. People here are different, Eliza said quietly, kinder than Iron Hollow. Iron Hollow was small and scared. Small places make people cruel because they need someone to feel superior to. Caleb's expression was thoughtful. Bent Creek is big enough that people have real problems to worry about. Survival matters more than gossip. Do you miss the cabin? The question hung between them for a moment. Caleb was quiet, his gaze distant, and Eliza knew he was thinking about Sarah, about the home he'd built with his own hands and abandoned to keep Eliza safe. Yes, he said finally. But not the way I thought I would. It was a place I went to remember Sarah, to hold on to her even though she was gone. But holding on like that, it wasn't living, it was just existing in the shadow of what I'd lost. He looked at her then, his eyes clear. Being here with you, building something new, that's living. And I'd rather have that than any cabin, no matter what it means to me. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. When the baby comes, when spring arrives, what then? Then we decide together, Caleb said. We could go back to the cabin if you want. Rebuild what needs rebuilding, make it ours instead of mine. Or we could stay here, find land, start fresh somewhere no one knows our history. Or we could go somewhere else entirely, California, Oregon, wherever you want. The only thing that matters is that we're together. Eliza stopped, gathering courage. I want to build something new. Somewhere we choose together, not running from the past, but walking toward a future. Caleb smiled, and the expression transformed his whole face. Then that's what we'll do. By the second week, Mourning Dove allowed Eliza to sit up and move around the room. By the third, she could take short walks outside, bundled in furs and leaning on Caleb's arm. Bent Creek revealed itself gradually through those walks, a rough but functional community of trappers, traders, families who'd come west looking for opportunity and found something harder but more honest than what they'd left behind. The settlement had a general store, a blacksmith, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the trading post that served as the social center. People nodded to Eliza and Caleb as they passed, some with curiosity, but most with simple acknowledgement. The story of their arrival had spread, the pregnant woman and the mountain man who'd carried her through a blizzard to save her life, and the community had adopted them with the casual generosity of people who understood that survival often depended on helping strangers. It was during one of these walks, a month after their arrival, that they saw the riders, 4 men on horseback, moving slowly down the main street, their eyes scanning buildings and faces with the methodical attention of people searching for something specific. Eliza recognized them instantly. Garrett and his men, still hunting, still determined to settle the score Caleb had created when he'd turned them away at gunpoint. She froze, her hand tightening on Caleb's arm. He'd seen them too, his body going still and watchful in that way that meant he was calculating threats and responses. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Go to Morning Doves. Stay there until I come for you." "Caleb, no. Go." His voice was firm but not harsh. "I'll handle this." Every instinct screamed at Eliza to argue, to refuse to leave him alone facing men who'd already proven their willingness to pursue vengeance across miles of winter wilderness. But she knew that tone, knew that arguing would only distract him when he needed all his focus. So she nodded and moved as quickly as her still recovering body allowed toward the midwife's cabin at the edge of the settlement. She made it inside and turned to watch through the window as Caleb stood in the middle of the street, waiting, not hiding, not running, just standing there with that absolute stillness that made him seem carved from the mountain itself. Garrett saw him at the same moment Caleb had intended, when the riders were in the center of the settlement, surrounded by witnesses, with nowhere to run and no element of surprise. The lead rider pulled up short, his hand dropping instinctively toward his weapon before he seemed to register the crowd that had gathered, the trappers and traders who'd stopped their work to watch this confrontation with wary interest. "Rourke," Garrett said, his voice carrying in the cold air. "Fancy meeting you here." "Not fancy," Caleb said calmly. "Expected. Men like you never let things go. Men like me remember when we've been insulted. Remember when someone makes us look weak." Garrett's smile was ugly. "You owe us, Rourke. For running. For making us chase you through the snow like dogs. For the trouble you caused. I owe you nothing except the bullet I promised if you came back." Caleb's hand rested on the pistol at his hip, casual but ready. "But I'm a reasonable man. You turn around right now, ride out of Bent Creek, and we call it even. You get to keep your pride intact, and I get to keep my woman safe. Everyone wins." "That's not how this works," one of the other riders said, his hand already on his gun. "You don't get to—" "Actually, that's exactly how this works," a new voice interrupted. Henrik Johansson stepped out of the lumber mill, a rifle held loosely in his hands. Behind him, 3 more men emerged from various buildings, all armed, all watching the riders with the cold pragmatism of men who'd fought before and would do so again if necessary. "This is our town, our friend. And you 4 are outnumbered and outgunned." Garrett looked around, seeming to truly register the crowd for the first time. At least a dozen armed men now stood in a loose semicircle, not threatening but not backing down either. The odds had shifted dramatically, and they all knew it. "This is between me and Rourke," Garrett said, trying to salvage some control. "No," Henrik said flatly. "This is between you and Bent Creek. Caleb's one of us now. You threaten him. You threaten all of us. And we don't take kindly to threats." The tension stretched like wire pulled too tight. Eliza held her breath, watching Caleb stand utterly still while around him the community he'd lived in for barely a month closed ranks to protect him. It was the opposite of Iron Hollow. Instead of feeding someone to wolves to satisfy cruelty, these people stood together against it. Garrett seemed to realize he'd miscalculated badly. Whatever advantage he'd thought surprise would give him had evaporated the moment the settlement had chosen sides. He could fight, but he'd lose. Badly. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. We'll go. But this isn't over, Rourke. You hear me? It's over, Caleb said, and there was something final in his tone. You came here looking for revenge and found a town willing to kill you for it. That's the end of this story. You ride out now, you live, you come back, you die. Choose. For a long moment, Garrett stared at Caleb with naked hatred. Then he yanked his horse's reins hard, turning the animal toward the edge of town. The other riders followed, and within minutes they disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing but hoofprints in the snow and a collective exhalation from the gathered crowd. Henrik clapped Caleb on the shoulder. You all right? Fine, Caleb said, though Eliza could see the tension in his shoulders, the aftermath of adrenaline that he was carefully controlling. Thank you. All of you. No thanks needed, Henrik said. That's what neighbors do. The crowd dispersed gradually, returning to their work with the casual acceptance of people who'd just defended one of their own and saw nothing unusual in it. Caleb stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked straight to Mourning Dove's cabin, to Eliza. She met him at the door, and he pulled her into his arms without a word, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt him shaking, reaction, relief, delayed fear, and she held him back just as fiercely. It's over, she whispered against his chest. They're gone. For now. His voice was muffled against her hair. But even if they come back, we're not alone anymore. We have people who'll stand with us. We have a home, Eliza corrected gently. A real one. Not just a place, but people who care whether we live or die. He pulled back enough to look at her, his eyes bright with emotion. You were right about building something new. This is it. This is where we belong. That night, they talked seriously about the future for the first time since arriving in Bent Creek. Caleb had saved nearly every penny from his work at the mill, and combined with what they could get from selling the pelts he'd brought from the cabin, they had enough to buy land come spring. Henrik knew of a valley about 10 miles north, good water, timber for building, far enough from the settlement for privacy, but close enough for community when they needed it. We could build a real house, Caleb said, sketching plans in the dirt floor with a stick. 2 rooms to start, more as we need them. A barn for animals, a root cellar that won't flood, something permanent. A home, Eliza said, her hand on her belly where the baby had started to move in small, fluttering kicks. For all of us. For all of us, Caleb agreed. The winter months passed in preparation and planning. Eliza's pregnancy progressed normally under Mourning Dove's watchful care, her body recovering from the trauma of their flight and strengthening for the ordeal of birth. Caleb worked long hours at the mill, saved every penny, and spent his evenings with Eliza, learning everything Mourning Dove could teach him about helping with childbirth in case he needed to. Most men don't want to know this, Mourning Dove said one evening, demonstrating positioning and breathing techniques with a rag doll. They think it's women's work. Most men are fools, Caleb said bluntly. If something goes wrong, I want to know how to help instead of standing there useless. Mourning Dove smiled approvingly. Your woman chose well. Spring came slowly to the mountains, measured in melting snow and mud that made the streets impassable for days at a time. But with it came possibility, the chance to travel, to build, to start the life they'd been planning through the long winter months. And with spring came labor. Eliza woke on a clear April morning to cramping that she knew instantly was different from the false contractions she'd been having for weeks. She lay still for a moment, breathing through it, then reached over to shake Caleb awake. It's time, she said quietly. He was on his feet instantly, pulling on clothes with hands that shook despite his efforts to stay calm. I'll get Mourning Dove. Not yet. Eliza caught his hand. It's early still. First babies take time. Just stay with me for now. So he did, sitting beside her as the contractions came and went in waves that gradually grew stronger and closer together. They talked between pains about nonsense and everything, names they'd considered and rejected, what kind of cradle Caleb would build, whether the baby would have Eliza's eyes or some unknown father's features. It doesn't matter, Caleb said firmly when Eliza voiced that last worry. This is our child, ours. Biology is just details. By midday, the contractions were intense enough that Caleb went for Mourning Dove, despite Eliza's protests. The midwife arrived with her bag of supplies and an expression of calm competence that made Eliza feel simultaneously better and more terrified. "How far apart?" Morning Dove asked, already examining Eliza with practiced efficiency. 5 minutes, Caleb said. "Maybe less." "Good. Fast for a first baby, but not dangerously so." Morning Dove looked at Eliza with kind eyes. "This is going to hurt more than anything you've ever felt. But you're strong, and your body knows what to do. Trust it." The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and effort, and Caleb's voice talking her through each contraction with a steadiness that belied the fear she could see in his eyes. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool water, breathed with her when Morning Dove instructed him to. He never flinched, never looked away, never suggested that this was too much or that he wanted to be anywhere else. "You're doing so well," he murmured during a brief respite between contractions. "So strong. I'm so proud of you." "I can't," Eliza gasped as another wave hit. "It's too much. I can't." "You can. You are." His hand found hers, grounding her. "Just a little longer. You can do this." And somehow, impossibly, she did. The baby came as the sun set, sliding into Morning Dove's waiting hands with a cry that was the most beautiful sound Eliza had ever heard. She collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and shaking and overwhelmed, while Morning Dove cleaned the infant with swift, gentle motions. "A girl," the midwife announced, wrapping the baby in soft cloth, "healthy, angry, and already has opinions about the world, just like her mother." She placed the baby in Eliza's arms, and the world condensed to this tiny, perfect creature with wrinkled skin and dark hair and eyes that couldn't quite focus yet, but seemed to look right into Eliza's soul. Love hit her like a physical force, so intense it stole her breath. "Hello?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Hello, little one. I'm your mama." Caleb had gone completely still beside her, staring at the baby with an expression of wonder that made him look younger, softer, transformed. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched the baby's tiny hand. When her fingers instinctively closed around his thumb, something in his face cracked open. "She's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's absolutely perfect." "You want to hold her?" Eliza asked. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and Eliza transferred the precious bundle into his arms. Caleb held her like she was made of glass, his large, scarred hands impossibly gentle as he cradled her against his chest. The baby settled immediately, her crying fading to small, curious sounds. "Hey there," Caleb murmured. "Hey there, little girl. I'm your papa. And I promise you that I will love you and protect you every single day of your life. You will never doubt that you're wanted. Never doubt that you're mine." Watching him with their daughter, because she was theirs, regardless of biology, Eliza felt something settle deep in her chest. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not rescue, not escape, but partnership. A man who chose them both, not out of obligation, but out of love. A family built on choice rather than blood. "What should we name her?" Caleb asked, still not looking away from the baby. Eliza thought about Sarah, the woman who'd lived and died in the cabin that had first given Eliza shelter, the woman whose memory had helped Caleb learn to love again. "What about Sarah, if you're comfortable with that?" Caleb's eyes filled. "Sarah," he repeated softly, testing it. "Sarah Moore Rourke." He looked at Eliza. "It's perfect. She'd have liked it, liked her." "Sarah Moore Rourke," Eliza agreed. "Our daughter." Morning Dove had slipped out at some point, giving them privacy for this first meeting of their new family. They sat together in the golden light of sunset, Caleb holding Sarah while Eliza rested against his shoulder, and for the first time in either of their lives, they felt completely whole. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and infinite tenderness. Sarah proved to be a healthy, demanding infant with strong lungs and definite opinions about when she wanted to eat, sleep, or be held. Caleb took to fatherhood with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else, learning to change diapers and soothe crying fits and rock the baby to sleep while Eliza recovered from the birth. Henrik gave Caleb time off from the mill without hesitation, and the community brought food and supplies and hand-me-down baby clothes, with the generous practicality of people who understood how hard those first weeks could be. Margaret and James Fletcher traveled from Helena when they heard the news, bringing gifts and gratitude and the joy of seeing friends who'd saved their lives now beginning their own family. "She's beautiful," Margaret said, holding Sarah with the easy confidence of an experienced mother. "And she has your eyes, Eliza. That same determination." Thomas, now healthier and happier than he'd been on the mountain, was fascinated by the baby. He asked 100 questions and appointed himself Sarah's official protector, promising solemnly to teach her everything he knew when she was old enough. As spring deepened into summer, Caleb and Eliza began building on the land they'd purchased. Henrik and several other men from Bent Creek helped raise the frame, and slowly a house took shape in the valley Caleb had chosen. It was simple but solid. 2 rooms with potential for more, a wide porch for summer evenings, windows that let in light and mountain views. Not a cabin for hiding, but a home for living. They moved in on a warm July day, carrying Sarah in a sling Eliza had sewn and boxes of the few possessions they'd accumulated. The house smelled of fresh-cut pine and possibility. Caleb built a fire in the stone hearth he'd constructed with his own hands, and they sat together on the porch as the sun set, watching their daughter sleep and their future unfold. "Do you ever think about Iron Hollow?" Eliza asked quietly. "About how different things would be if you hadn't been there that day?" "Every day," Caleb admitted, "but not with regret. That was the day my life started again, the day I stopped just existing and started living." "Mine too." Eliza shifted Sarah in her arms, marveling at how natural this felt. "I was so angry when they tied me to that chair, so humiliated. But if that hadn't happened, I never would have met you, never would have found this life." "I don't believe things happen for a reason," Caleb said thoughtfully. "I think terrible things happen, and we choose what we do with them. You could have let Iron Hollow break you. You could have stayed a victim. But you didn't. You fought, you survived, you built something better." "We built something better," Eliza corrected. "Together." He smiled and pulled her closer, careful of the baby sleeping between them. "Together," he agreed. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars emerged overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Not a threat, just a voice in the wilderness, claiming its own territory. The sound no longer frightened Eliza. It was simply part of the mountain, part of the life they'd chosen. Sarah stirred in her sleep, making the small sounds that meant she'd wake soon and demand to be fed. Eliza prepared for the disruption with practiced ease, no longer overwhelmed by the constant needs of an infant, but settled into the rhythm of motherhood. "I've been thinking," Caleb said as Eliza began to nurse the baby, "about Iron Hollow." "What about it?" "About going back." He held up a hand when Eliza stiffened. "Not to stay, not to live, but to face it, to show Hutchins and everyone else who tried to break you that they failed, that you not only survived but thrived." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, considering. Part of her recoiled from the idea. Why return to a place that had only ever brought her pain? But another part, the part that had grown stronger on the mountain and through childbirth and building this new life, understood what Caleb was offering. Closure. Proof that cruelty didn't win. The satisfaction of showing her former tormentors exactly what she'd become without them. "When?" she asked. "Whenever you're ready. This year, next year, 10 years from now. Or never, if that's what you choose. But the option is there." In the end, they went that September, when Sarah was 5 months old and the mountain aspens had turned gold and orange. They rode into Iron Hollow on a clear morning, Caleb on horseback with Sarah in a carrier he'd fashioned, Eliza beside him on a horse Henrik had loaned them. They came not as supplicants or refugees, but as people who'd built a life and wanted nothing from this place except to close a chapter. The town looked smaller than Eliza remembered, shabbier. The same buildings, the same square where she'd been tied and mocked, but somehow diminished by the life she'd built elsewhere. People stopped and stared as they rode through, recognition dawning on faces that had once sneered at her. Mayor Hutchins emerged from his office, his expression shifting from surprise to anger to something that might have been shame before settling on defensive hostility. "Eliza Moore," he said, her maiden name a deliberate slight. "I thought you'd learn to stay away." "I did stay away," Eliza said calmly, her voice carrying in the quiet street. "Built a home elsewhere, married a good man, had a beautiful daughter. I came back to show you something." "And what's that?" "That you failed." She dismounted, handed the reins to Caleb, and walked toward Hutchins with her head high. "You tried to break me, tried to make me believe I was worthless, that I deserved nothing but mockery and cruelty. You failed. I'm happy. I'm loved. I have a family and a home and a life that's better than anything this town could have offered." Hutchins' face flushed red. "You think you're better than us now? Think that mountain savage and his bastard?" He didn't finish the sentence. Caleb was off his horse and in front of Hutchins before anyone could blink, one hand fisted in the mayor's shirt, lifting him almost off his feet. "Careful," Caleb said, his voice soft and deadly. "That's my wife and daughter you're talking about, and if you insult them again, I'll make you regret every word." "Caleb," Eliza said quietly, "he's not worth it." Caleb held Hutchins for a moment longer, then released him with a slight shove that sent the man stumbling backward. "You're right. He's not." They remounted without another word and rode through the rest of Iron Hollow at a measured pace, letting everyone see them, see Sarah, see the evidence of a life built beyond cruelty's reach. Mrs. Halloway watched from her doorway, her expression unreadable. The baker who'd withdrawn his charity stared from his window. The men who'd stood silent while Eliza was humiliated looked away when Caleb's gaze found them. Only when they'd cleared the town completely did Eliza allow herself to exhale. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked. "Free," she said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I thought I'd feel angry or vindicated or something big, but I just feel free, like I finally let go of the last piece of this place that had a hold on me." "Good." He reached over and took her hand. "That's good." They rode back toward Bent Creek and their home in the valley, leaving Iron Hollow behind for the last time. Sarah slept peacefully against Caleb's chest, oblivious to the significance of the journey. And as they traveled, Eliza felt the final weight of her past lift and drift away like smoke. The years that followed were not easy, frontier life never was, but they were good. Rich with work and laughter and the small joys of watching Sarah grow from infant to toddler to a fierce, curious child who loved the mountains as much as her parents did. Caleb taught her to track and hunt and respect the wilderness. Eliza taught her to read and sew and understand that strength came in many forms. They had 2 more children in the years after Sarah, a boy they named Henrik, after the man who'd helped them build their home, and another girl they called Grace because that's what she was, an unexpected gift in their 40s when they'd thought their family was complete. The house expanded to accommodate them all, and the valley rang with children's laughter and the sounds of a life fully lived. Caleb never completely lost his edge, that watchfulness that came from years of solitary survival, but it softened over time, tempered by love and community and the daily miracle of family. He aged well, the gray in his beard spreading, the lines around his eyes deepening, but his strength remained. So did his absolute devotion to Eliza and their children. Eliza bloomed in ways she'd never thought possible. The woman who'd once believed herself worthless became the heart of a family, a respected member of the Bent Creek community, someone people came to for advice and comfort and practical help. She never forgot what cruelty felt like, which made her exceptionally kind to others facing their own struggles. She and Mourning Dove became close friends, and eventually Eliza learned enough from the older woman to help with births herself, passing on knowledge and compassion to new mothers who needed both. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb took Eliza back to the original cabin. It was still standing, weathered but intact, and they spent a day there remembering everything that had brought them to this point. Caleb showed her where he'd first seen the smoke from Iron Hollow's square, the exact spot where he'd decided to intervene instead of walking away. "What made you do it?" Eliza asked, standing in that spot and trying to imagine the choice he'd faced. "You didn't know me. You could have kept walking." "I couldn't," Caleb said simply. "Not and live with myself. Sarah would have been ashamed of me if I'd walked past someone who needed help, and I couldn't—" He paused, searching for words. "I couldn't let another woman suffer when I had the power to stop it. Not after I'd failed to save Sarah from fever and pain. Maybe it was selfish, but I needed to save someone. And you needed saving, so it worked out. We saved each other, Eliza said, taking his hand. You gave me a life, but I gave you a reason to live again. That's not selfish, that's grace. They stayed in the cabin that night, making love in the bed where they'd first learned to trust each other. And in the morning, they rode home to their children and their life, carrying the past with them, but not burdened by it. Sarah grew into a young woman as determined and fierce as her mother, as skilled and calm as her father. She had no interest in marriage or settlement life, but instead traveled through the territories, learning from native tribes and frontier families alike, becoming a healer in her own right. She came home often, bringing stories and news from the wider world, and each visit was a joy. Henrik followed his namesake into lumber and building, finding satisfaction in creating things that would outlast him. He married a quiet girl from Bent Creek and built his own home 3 valleys over, close enough to visit but far enough for independence. Grace never wanted to leave the valley. She learned every plant and animal, every season and weather pattern, becoming as much a part of the mountain as the stone itself. She was content in ways that didn't require explanation, finding joy in simplicity. And Caleb and Eliza watched them all grow and leave and return, the way children should. They grew old together in the house they'd built, their bodies slowing but their love deepening with each year. They sat on the porch on summer evenings, remembering and planning and simply being together. They faced hardships, illness, harsh winters, the inevitable losses that come with a life fully lived, but they faced them together, the way they'd faced everything since that day in Iron Hollow Square. On a morning in early spring, when Eliza was 63 and Caleb nearly 70, they woke before dawn as they always had. The valley was beginning to green, the first flowers pushing through the last snow. Caleb made coffee while Eliza fed the chickens they still kept. They sat on the porch as the sun rose, warming their old bones, and watched the mountain wake. "Do you have any regrets?" Eliza asked, a question she'd never thought to ask before. Caleb considered it seriously, as he considered all her questions. "None that matter," he said finally. "Everything that brought us here, good and bad, I wouldn't change it. Would you?" "Not a single thing," Eliza said. "Even Iron Hollow, even the pain, because it all led to this, to you, to our family, to this life. To mercy," Caleb added, "which is what you gave me when you chose to stay, when you let me love you and Sarah and build something beautiful from something broken." "The mountain's mercy," Eliza said, remembering that first desperate journey through the snow when she'd thought she wouldn't survive. "That's what you were. The mountain sent you to save me." "We saved each other," Caleb said, echoing her words from years before. "And we built something worth saving." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, 2 people who'd been broken by the world and found each other in the wilderness. 2 people who'd chosen love over fear, partnership over loneliness, hope over despair. The mountain stood behind them, silent witness to a life well lived, to love that had transformed cruelty into grace. And in the valley they'd made their own, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward. Caleb and Eliza Rourke lived out their days in the peace they'd earned through survival and choice, and the simple, radical act of choosing each other when the world said they weren't worth choosing. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.